Hi everyone, in this video, I'm going to briefly introduce my assignment 1 in unit FIT5225. In this assignment, we are going to build a web server and upload to cloud environment using Kubernetes service and distribute inbound requests among pods. Here is my web server. First, we need to open a port for outside clients that can access to the server. We specify the host ID and set threaded to true for multi-threaded purposes, and we also open the port 5000. And then we have to specify a route for our main function and open post method to deal with post request. So if user want to access the server using the right port number and the right route, then the main function will be called. In the main function, first we need to get a request from the client. After we get a requested image, we need to convert the image from string format to binary format using the base64 function, and then load the image. After we load the image, we need to load the pre-trained model from darknet using the load model method, and finally send the image to prediction. The prediction method will return a list of objects that are detected inside the image, and finally append with the corresponding image ID and set it back using JSON format. We can see that, and here is how I pack the object information and send it back to the main function. If there is more than one detection, then we use a for loop to add the information into an object list and send it to the main function. After we done the web server, we will need to build a Docker file and create a Docker image for our web service. In the Docker file, first we need to use from to pull the environment for our container. After that, we need to install some dependencies that we are going to use, like Python 3 and OpenCV. And then I define my working directory in my new container. After that, we need to copy the codes and files to my new working directory in the container. So for example here, we are using object detection.py file as a server and YOLO files for object detection library, also the requirements file. Then we install the requirements file, which will list all the libraries that we are going to use in our web server. And finally, we want to run the object detection.py, which is our server. And here's the requirements file. We can see we list all the dependencies that we are going to use in our web server. Okay, here we are in a Nectar VM terminal, and we can check our cluster and deployment and pods information using kubectl get nodes deployments pods -o wide. Using this command, we can see that I created a cluster with one master and one worker node, and the deployment name FIT5225. And inside the deployment, there are 3 pods running. Okay, here is my deployment.yml file. We specify the API version that we want, and this kind specify what type of things that we are going to create. Here we are going to create a deployment. And we set up the name and labels for the deployment. We set the replicas to 3 to fit the assignment specification. And we set up the template of the pods that the deployments will create. Each pods are using the image to create nodes and set up the container ports. In these resources, we set up the highest and the lowest threshold for the CPU resources. And this is my service YML file. Same as before, we set up the API version and set kind to service, and then we set up the service name. The port is important here. The node port is the internal communication port. So one pod need to communicate with another pod. We'll have to use this one. And port 80 is setting the external user using this port to link to the service. And finally, the target port is like the final destination. It needs to be the same post that we define in our web server. And I also want to mention how I built my Docker image. By building the Docker image, we need to finish our Docker file first, and then we run the docker build command. After I build the Docker image in the local, I add a tag to my image and pushed it into the Docker Hub in my local terminal. And then I go to my Nectar VM to pull my image back to the cluster. And that's how I done with the Docker image. Okay, we can see that here is my Nectar VM, my server. And this is the IP of the server. And for the security group, I use port 80 to test my web service as I configured before. And this port 22 is also in use because I need to link to the cluster from my local machine. Finally, let me illustrate how the service is working and can be reached from outside the VM. First, we need to make sure all the pods are running, and then we can go to the client side in our local machine. We execute the client code and link to the server using the port we define 80 and IP address for my Nectar VM. We can see that the whole system is working. The detection result keeps sending from the server. And let's see how the pod's workload looks like. We can use the log command to see the workload is distributed inside the pods. And we can see that the request is equally distributed in these pods. Okay, that's it for my presentation. Thank you for your time.